I disagree. I think giving over £3,000 of support this year and last compares extremely favourably to the support that the US government or European governments have given to their populations. It's very, very generous, around £100 billion of support to help people through this very difficult period.
Then why are we not doing as well as them in terms of bringing down inflation?
Because we have a combination of factors which they don't have. So we have higher dependence on gas, which is what countries like Italy have. We import around half our food, which is what Germany does. And we have very low unemployment, a tight labour market, which is what happens in America. We've got all of those factors.
And Brexit was a big factor in...
No.
Well, imagine the Chancellor's shock when he finds out Brexit has reduced the competitiveness of the UK economy, put downwards pressure on the pound and upwards pressure on prices, limited imports of goods and limited the supply of labour, all of which has contributed to high inflation. And he'll fall off his chair when he hears this. Data collected across more than 300 UK companies in 2022 found Brexit was proving the biggest headache for British businesses, ranking even higher than Russia's war in Ukraine and rising energy costs. None of this should come as a surprise to anyone, because the Bank of England laid out in advance of Brexit that it would be a negative supply shock for a period of time, and the consequence of that would be a weaker pound, higher inflation and weaker growth, all of which has happened.
Brexit was a big factor in...
Never underestimate just how thick this government thinks we all are. Inflation in the UK has remained stubbornly high. In June it was almost 8%. And food price inflation in July was more than 13%. Now, yes, the shockwaves triggered by the global pandemic and the impact of Russia's invasion on food and energy bills have been felt globally, but inflation in the UK has climbed faster and been more stubborn than in the US and the European Union, something the Chancellor has openly admitted.
If you look at other countries, America's got inflation down to 3%. In the eurozone, it's just over 5%.
According to researchers at the London School of Economics, British households have paid a staggering £7 billion since Brexit to cover the extra cost of trade barriers on food imports from the EU. So while Brexit may not have been the only reason for our surging food inflation, the higher costs it's added appear to have played a significant part. Remember, more than a quarter of our food is imported from the EU. And with mounting evidence that red tape, form filling and other hurdles required to bring goods into the country after Brexit have added to food bills, both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister continue to just stick their heads in the sand and pretend it's not happening.
Brexit was a big factor in...
It's not just completely irresponsible, it's grossly negligent. And from there it gets worse. The end of free movement means hundreds of thousands of fewer workers in the UK, which has created high inflation labour shortages, a problem acknowledged by the Prime Minister himself.
What's the number one challenge other than energy costs? It's getting access to workers.
But when asked what he plans to do about it, this was his completely insane response.
We know that chronic labour shortages and weak post-Brexit trade are holding economic growth back. You heard this morning businesses are saying we need looser immigration rules and closer ties with our biggest market, the EU. Are you listening to them?
I think the most pressing priority right now is tackling illegal migration.
Meanwhile, the Chancellor openly admits...
And we have very low unemployment, a tight labour market.
And both the Deputy Prime Minister and the Energy Secretary agree that labour shortages, in part a consequence of the ending of free movement after Brexit, is a key factor in the UK faring so badly when compared to the US and the eurozone.
The UK is an outlier. In continental Europe, in the United States, inflation is much lower. Interest rates are much lower. Why are we such an outlier?
So we have a combination of very low unemployment, lower than the EU average and most European countries, which means it gives you a tight labour market.
But we're an outlier, aren't we? I mean, the war in Ukraine has affected everybody. Europe's not got the same, Europe's looking at sort of 6%. America's looking at 4% in terms of interest rates. Why is Britain the outlier?
We also have the tight labour market that the US has, but that Europe doesn't have.
It's an astonishing admission from senior members of the government of the failure of its immigration policy since Brexit. So with all that in mind, listen to this again.
Brexit was a big factor in...
No.